doing. So I would say that we have around 1 hour, 25 minutes for discussion, for conversation, for your questions, comments, and without much delay, I would like to request our 3 panelists to take the floor, and if I may suggest, will Dr. Hewasa like to go first in terms of sharing the journey of repatriation? And I would also like to say that Tetso College and the students, staff, faculty has really been at the forefront of giving us their time and their generosity in exploring what does decolonization mean in the Naga context, and how will the future generation of Nagas think about repatriation. So without saying much, Hewasa, please, the time is yours. And take any time, anywhere between 7 to 8 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dolly, and my co-panelists. It's an honor for me to be here this afternoon for this lecture. As Dr. Dolly has mentioned, at Tetso College, we have had initial discussions with this topic of this repatriation, and it has elicited varied responses. I think, first of all, for our young generation, it's been a process, a time to process their past, the reality of colonization, and the history of their own identity. So it has been a good starting point for them to relook at, the life of their ancestors and to see the after effects of colonization as it actually happened. I think for most of the younger generation, they just be reading it in books, or they'd be hearing the stories from their from their grandfathers or great-great-grandfathers. So when we started off on this journey of discussion, for many, I would say that it was a time for them to just process, what repatriation actually means for them, and to also relook into the question of their own identity and how they can connect to the past. Since, as mentioned, it's mostly through narratives or through storytelling that they'd be hearing about these things. And so it's a start for them. But I'm happy to say that through these discussions, some of our own students, they've started projects and initiatives of their own. And one of them is here in the audience today also, where she's started a project to discuss about ornaments and the definition and the meaning of what these ornaments are. And so all of this discussion, I'm saying, has actually started a movement among them to actually question, what tradition is for them, what these significant symbols of the past are. So it's been a great starting point, I would say, for our young generation, and even for our own staff and faculty. I think it's a time, it's been an eye-opener also on, what this sense of recovery could mean to our Naga history. I think some of the questions also that emerge from the discussions are, how do we actually respond to this? How would the community collectively come to a consensus or a decision on what do we do with, how do we respond to the collections to the human remains when they come back home? And what would be the response of the community? How would we come to a meeting point on what do we do with, and how do we represent or present these remains to our own people? So I think that's one of the most important questions that comes up. The other thing is, what is the response of our community, and how big of a task is it for us to be able to connect with the family members and to understand, what they're going through and what must be done to give everyone closure. And I think the question of this repatriation has brought about two two important factors. That is about the question of reconciliation. As we all know, reconciliation is a two-way process. It can never happen alone. It brings up questions of how do we reconcile with the past, and in our contemporary settings, how do we negotiate with, this the recovery. The other thing is about the question of decolonization. How would we, relook at our past, create maybe new narratives or new understandings of our own history, since what we read about are mostly studies from anthropologists or administrators during that time. Since we come from an oral society, I think most of our memories are through the storytelling, through the folk stories, through our performances, through the rituals. And so the question of how does the younger generation, restart or relook into the narratives and the questions that are being asked, and how do we represent it? How do we deal with the kind of narratives to start the process of decolonization? And I think that's also that's also a point of contention there, or there's tension in this process of decolonization, because our younger generation, we're all in an education system that comes from the European university system. Our syllabuses or our contents, they're guided through a certain system that's already there. So I'm happy to say that some of our faculty are also involved in looking at ways in which culture, in which we can look back at the past and look at ways of imbibing our cultural practices and revising the pedagogy, the teaching pedagogy, the ways in which we teach, looking back at our cultural history and our cultural traditions. So I think this whole discussion, the point I'm trying to make is that through this whole discussion, I think thoughts like this have emerged and processes have begun to start alternative ways of looking at our own lived realities and how do we respond to it, how do we negotiate with, the kind of change and the discussion that's happening here in our state today. So I think that would sum it up for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hewasa. I would like to request our audience, you are also a participant today. So just because you see 4 of us here doesn't mean that we are going to lead the discussion and give you all the wisdom from the ends of the world. That's not true. That's never going to happen. I come into this initiative with more questions than answers. And some of the questions that I have, the questions that I have today, as member of the Recover, Restore, and Decolonize team, you will have the answer with you this afternoon. So with that spirit, we come to you. So please do write your notes, write your questions and your comments that you have as our panelists are sharing their journey. The next panelist I would like to invite to share is Dr. Paphino, so please take the time.
Yeah. Thank you, Morung Express, for having me as a panelist in this very important discussion. And friends, my entry into this dialogue of repatriation maybe is from a different perspective. When we look at today's dialogue, the topic, the way it is framed as the repatriation of something which has been lost. And after repatriating that, there is that kind of sense of that belief that it will, the strategy seems to me that after repatriating the lost, there will be belief and there will be hope. So it's framed in such a way. But to look at repatriation, the debate of repatriation today, I think it has to be rooted into the truth. Because when we say repatriation, is it only about objects? I think it goes deeper than the objects. And how did our remains or how did our objects landed up in museums abroad? These were like byproducts of ethnography. So the truth is that ethnography belongs to the museum. So how do you repatriate an ethnographic museum? That is, I think, the challenge for like institutions. Today we are privileged that we have the director of Pitt Rivers Museum also. So that institutions like Pitt Rivers Museum and all, I think there's also a challenge of how do you repatriate ethnographic museum? Because it's not about just objects. It's far deeper than that. There are labels, there are monographs. So all those things contributed to an ethnographic museum. So are we talking only about objects? So I think those are thoughts which have to be kind of looked into. And as far as the human remains is concerned, I think human remains has nothing to do with a race or ethnicity. It's about human rights. So when we repatriate human remains, it has to go to the descendant and things like that. But to frame it in like repatriating Naga or for that matter any race, I think that may not be the proper way of looking at human remains. It's a human rights, so it should be framed in such a way that when human remains are repatriated, it's repatriated not as ethnic kind of a thing, but as a human right. So yeah, that's my opening kind of statement which I've made. Yeah, thank you, Dolly. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paphino. I think the point that you make about human remains as a matter of human rights and how do we think about that is really an interesting idea, and it calls for us to reflect together. So thank you so much. I'm sure the audience will have many more questions on that. So I now would like to give the time to my colleague, Dr. Arkotong, to share his journey and his experience on this initiative.
Hello? Okay. Thank you for this. Using all the mics.
It's not your table.
It's not my name. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation and to be part of this panel. It's great to be here and to see so many people. And I think... And I do hope that we will be able to engage in some meaningful discussion kind of after we have our spiel. I mean, I want to start with a dream. And I was, this happened actually a few weeks ago, as I was preparing to travel to like Nagaland. A voice told me in my dream that this repatriation process, it needs to be a Naga one. So I mean, I still kind of remember that like voice so clearly. And I was telling like Laura when we were traveling up to Koyama this dream, and it struck me as quite important because we have so many like models of kind of repatriation, right? I mean, we've got the Australian one, we've got the Maori one. The Native Americans and so on, and I kept thinking, what would a Naga repatriation look like? So is that something that we have already established? We probably have not. And is that something that we're thinking about? We probably are. So I think this is what is the heart of the matter, I think, for me as a researcher. So one of the things that we need to clarify, I think, is that we are dealing primarily with human remains, the ancestral human remains which are currently at the Pitt Rivers Museum. We're not so much dealing with cultural artifacts or cultural objects, which are also quite large, at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So I think our reflections are more about the human remains aspect of this. And what constitute human remains or the ancestral human remains? They're different objects or different kind of classifications of what we call ancestral human remains. And of course, they are the skulls and the bones, okay? And they're also skin and tissue and teeth, associated with certain objects like spears or shields, and also human hairs. And in all of the all of these are classified as ancestral human remains. So the thing that we are trying to do, at least my role currently, is to do provenance research, is to go a bit more deeper into these objects and trying objects, the human remains, and try and understand where they came from, or, what's their context and what's their history. And the process of research is also engaging with the public, so you all, and to try and take this to the different communities and try and understand what is happening here. Do they have any memories of these human remains? What are the histories that are there but people have suppressed it? So this is a long process, as Dolly's already mentioned. It's going to take many more years, but we are hopefully trying to get some understanding of the kinds of histories which perhaps have been lost and which perhaps people don't talk so much about. And that's the heart of the project, I think. So when we have spoken to people, I think people come with a variety of emotions, right? They're very mixed. Some are saying, yes, we should engage with the process, we should bring back our ancestral remains, and others are more circumspect, and others are also undecided. But I think all of these emotions are valid because we're not asking you to have a quick black and white answer immediately, because this is such a kind of experience which involves so many feelings and emotions and words and thinking, okay? So it's not that we have to have an immediate answer right now and I can decide on this, and So that's my first kind of impression. The second is, I think, it gives us an opportunity to understand our history. And some might say that we already understand our history. But I think there is an opportunity to reflect more on the kinds of histories that perhaps has not really been spoken about. Now all of you are aware, and I think, many scholars draw on people like J.H. Hutton, J.P. Mills, and so on, right? And these, for many years, have been the classic texts. So, if you want to kind of introduce someone to the Awanagas, you give them kind of J.P. Mills's classic text on the Awanagas, or Sumi Nagas, you go to Hutton's, and Angami Nagas, you go to Hutton's, right? But I think there is an alternative history that needs to be told, kind of aside of these colonial texts. And as kind of Hewasa was also saying about this idea of oral culture, that a lot of our traditions are orally transmitted. And so I think trying to understand the history through the vibrant textuality of orality is something that we really need to engage with, and trying to understand these histories. And understanding these histories are not simply about the human remains. they also like resonate with other aspects of it, right? So yesterday, so we were in like Mitsipima talking with the community, and it was so interesting that when we were talking about human remains, people were then talking about say like burial kind of rituals, and how do we kind of innovate. So people were saying that we can bring Christian elements of it, we can bring traditional elements of it. And I found that really, really, really kind of interesting and also really inspired that people can kind of innovate as well. So I think culture and traditions are not only stuck in the past, but we are constantly innovating, and that is the joy of being human. I think it's to innovate. So I think it comes to my third point is that of ownership. So I think we have to take ownership of the process. We have to kind of understand what the person in my dream was telling me, that, this has to be a Naga process. And I think that's where decolonization really comes in. I think, well, we can strip, all the theories of decolonization, which all of you are, I'm sure, kind of aware of and can articulate it much better. But I think the idea of ownership and taking ownership of the process and taking kind of ownership of the understanding of our histories is where decolonization is at its sharpest, I think. And that is something that we need to think about, as we go on. The fourth point, I think, is that of like memory. And this is something that I've encountered a lot when, with the initial kind of like research that we have been doing, people have been saying to us that we don't remember all of this. People, the elders have all passed away, and how are we to make sense of all the human remains? Okay, if the elders are not present, then how are we going to tell the histories? And I think this is where it becomes quite kind of interesting, but also quite complex. I think we think of like memory as a very continuous process, right? It's passed on from one generation to the other. But also I think like memory can also be very discontinuous, that we can have gaps and we can have disruptions, which is okay. But I think the thing is, like memory is also embodied in our like bodies, our physical like bodies, and is also embodied in the landscape kind of around us, the ecologies. So I think that is where we draw our inspiration from to enable us to also like remember and to go back to our human bodies and the kind of ecologies around us, which will help us remember. Now I'm constantly like remembering, about my Hawaiian friends, who like we have also spoken to, about this kind of repatriation process. And what they were telling us was that the protocols and the specific language to address the ancestral remains have been lost, okay? And they had no language to address these ancestral remains. But they had to come up. They had to go back into history, remember, and also like borrow other practices from the like Maori as well as from the Polynesian people to help them really come up with the language, the protocols of how we address the kinds of ancestral remains. So I think we may be thinking, how do we do this? I mean, like, because we don't remember anything or the elders have all passed away, right? But I think there is capacity. And I think the capacity is there in order for us to draw on the basic things that we have, the human body, the land, the ecology, the kind of nature around us, and of course the stories that have been told from one generation to the other. So my final point is, I think when we think about repatriation, of course the process is still quite far off, right? So the actual coming of the ancestral remains to our Naga homelands is quite far away. But what we are doing right now is engaging with the process, trying to understand from the public, the different communities, to really get a sense of what this kind of repatriation is about. And I think the process hopefully will bring about a kind of healing. I think that is where Indigenous repatriation is at its strongest. It's not about closing the past, I think, but it's about understanding the past, our history, so that we as a people can kind of understand that and think about the future, think about our futures, but also, you know, the children and like the unborn who will come after us. What sort of like legacy are we going to leave them? And I think that is where kind of Indigenous repatriation is at its strongest. The power to heal, the power to transform society, to go through that process together. And I think that is at the essence of what we are trying to accomplish through the process. Thank you.
Hewasa, if I may ask you first, as the chair, as an educator from the sharing that you did this afternoon, as an educator, do you envision that Naga institutions, especially here in Nagaland, and I know that you have a responsibility and you also really play a very central role in Tetsa College as one of the founders and one of the visionaries, as the principal of a college here, a university which has become a university, and a very interesting one at that, because of the courses that you all teach. So have you thought about what would an indigenous curriculum look like in the context of Naga education? And I'm thinking about this because we had a conversation yesterday, last evening at OTS with the seminarians and the staff there. And the conversation about curriculum came up, and it was Akam who was sharing that among the Palestinian people when they were talking about curriculum. There are three types. One's the taught curriculum, the one that we teach. One is the missing curriculum, what is missing from us, from our people today. And the hidden curriculum, what is it that we know that's in our head and we so long to read and write and learn and teach. And I'm speaking about myself as a teacher today, but yet we are not able to do that. So one, about an indigenous curriculum, and second, about what is taught, what is missing, and what is hidden. And not particularly at Tetsa College, but as an educator and as a principal that you see in Naga institutions. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the question, Dr. Dolly. I think this is a very pertinent issue in the education sector. We have recently at Tetsa College discussed about including indigenous engagement and education in our discussions, even if it cannot be formally a part of the syllabus. When I say formally a part of the syllabus, because we are under Naga-led University and we have a prescribed format that teachers have to follow. But there are things that we as educators, I believe that we can go beyond the syllabus or try to incorporate it within our teaching practices so that the students can start engaging in their own indigenous identity, the indigenous community, and also reaching out to the external, to the public, so that they can try to create an impact within the communities. And so when you mentioned about the indigenous curriculum, earlier I mentioned about our faculty also being engaged in this process of creating an indigenous curriculum where they can look at our own cultural practices and see how that can be imbibed into our teaching methodology by trying to incorporate the best practices. When we're talking about going back to the past, I think there's also an awareness that has to be there about what elements do we pick up from the past, what elements do we choose to revive and restore, because that, as we renegotiate, I think there has to be a lot of renegotiation when we are reincorporating our past practices or looking back at our history and culture. So this engagement, I think, is very important and has been, I would say, missing in many ways. to allow our student communities to actually also respond and also get an opportunity to reflect on, their own identity and culture. We study our history from the textbooks that are there, but there's not enough of our own stories that are being told. So projects like folklore collections, I think some of that's been an ongoing process within our students. They've tried to collect folklore and try to bring it out in print and publish it or record these stories from elders. That's one that has been that's been ongoing, and it's all done through trial and error. They're learning how to refine it so that the most authentic versions can actually be published or can be open to the public. That's there. And another project is with regard to languages, the different languages that we have in Naga-led. I think we're attempting to also try to look into creating a glossary for our different tribes here in Naga-led, because I think needs to be much more of that. We have a few dictionaries amongst some of the communities that have been published, but there are many languages that are left undocumented, not published, or there's not enough studies that have been done with regard to the language or even the cultural practices. So engagement with that is something that we believe needs to be a responsibility of educational institutes. It is a challenge, I think. The challenges are definitely there, but I think that's something that we definitely need to give attention and focus towards, so that our own students can be the ones who are retelling these narratives or understanding what it means to represent, or what it means to, if we misrepresent or give misinformation, that's also one of the dangers that our students, our community needs to be aware of. So all of this, I think, is an area that definitely, I think, we want to be focusing on. But we're in the process of starting a language glossary. Our linguistics department is looking into that with regard to three languages have been chosen. So hopefully, for that, we'll need to look at the locals to be able to give to tell us, to speak the languages so that transcription can start. So that's a project for 2024, an upcoming one.
Thank you so much. This is really exciting. So I was wondering if I could have two questions for Dr. Paphino. I think you made some really, really important points, and I was wondering if you could share with us about history and ethnography. And I'm looking at perhaps here in the context of texts, colonial texts. And so when you gave us this very generous question about how do you repatriate ethnographic museums, and you play such an important role, so we look up to you. You are part of the government, and you head this art culture initiative. So we are researchers, part of, I think both Arko and I, and a lot of us, part of an institution which is even outside the country. And whether it's you or we have, I think, Professor Anungla right here, who has headed so many government initiatives. So we look to you all to be our guides and to be the voice of reason and to be your teachers here. I, for one, have never worked with the government of Naga-led in terms of art, in terms of the vision, and so we come to you for guidance. So in terms of this question that you offer us this afternoon so generously, how do you repatriate ethnographic museums? I would like to perhaps offer you the question and guide us through, maybe with your own experience. I know that as an anthropologist myself, we have some challenges in terms of infrastructure, maybe the conditions of our museums. So perhaps I also think about collaboration founded on solidarity and generosity, where institutions like the Pit Rivers and others become our allies, right? And so the second question I had for you was this idea that you offer us about human remains as a matter of human rights in the 21st century. And if you could tell us, a little bit of your thought and how can we proceed and think about the repatriation here as Naga people. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Dolly. On the first question regarding repatriation of utopic kind of repatriation, because I think it hasn't been done yet, so in that I think there panels and forums like this are very important, where independent agencies can play. And I'm not sure about whether government can, and under constitutional authorities can actually do such kind of things. Because see, like in Nagaland also, when we say about decolonizing museum and things like that, Nagaland itself, we have so many district museums. All the decisions are given in Kohima. So like for decolonization, we're trying to repatriate. But in the system of governance itself, there is a kind of hierarchical decisions and things like that. So in this kind of situation of repatriating ethnographic museums, I think like forums where they are like independent agencies having like like common mind can be more practical. And of course, for the ethnographic museums and the institutions of museums, it may also have its own compulsions. Like some may be under, trustees and things like that. Some may be like autonomous, these things. So how do we kind of negotiate those things? And then when it repatriated into its source land, like if we depend on the government, where's the guarantee that it will be like a kind of a decolonized kind of a process? So And regarding the second question about human remains and about being a human right is, it's just kind of my thought, because the whole ancestral remains and the whole movement for repatriating human remains, it has been framed in such a way that it's about ethnicity. So I don't have a solution to that. But how do we think of it as kind of a human rights? That is just kind of a thinking loud. But I also doesn't have that kind of a solution at the moment. Yeah. Thank you.
We have to share this, huh? Very good. All right. So I have how many questions? Maybe I have 3 for you. Arko. Okay. So thank you so much for, it's been really a pleasure to work with you as a colleague, as a brother, as a friend. So Arko and I go a long way. We are both fellow anthropologists. And, we have been talking about this initiative for years during the pandemic on Zoom. And every time we talk, we end up talking about Naga food. So, anyway, from research, we go to food, and that's where all our conversations end. Anyway. So, Arko, I wanted to ask you about, you started your very generous reflection about what would a Naga repatriation look like. And you were offering us different possibilities for you, right? Forget that all of us exist right now at this moment, but for you as Arkotong, as a fellow Naga anthropologist, as a fellow traveler along with the Naga people, what would you dream that a Naga repatriation looks like? One. And the second one that I was thinking about, I think it's connected to Dr. Paphino's reflection, is about ownership of our history. So we know the challenges that exist within systems. If this was to be a community initiative, with its own shortcomings, and during the pandemic, post-pandemic, we're having this discussion. What and how would we envision initiating a process of ownership of our history in this journey of repatriation?
I think, so how would I envision Naga repatriation, or what is the model, I guess, is something that perhaps we are all thinking about. And I think one of the things that maybe resonates with Dr. Paphino's point as well about human rights is about human dignity, I think. With the number of people that we have spoken to, they kind of often say that keeping our ancestors, in spaces outside of this homeland, right? In cabinets or wherever, in kind of storage, is not the right thing. We have to bring them back and lay them to rest. And I think that is about human dignity at the end. I mean, think about how we would treat our own parents, our own grandparents, right? So I mean, if they were exhibited, if their bones were shown somewhere, how would we feel? And I think that is the crux of the matter, I think. It's not, the question then comes to this notion of human dignity. And I think maybe that is what I'm envisioning at the end, of course. But the process, how might we do this, is a tricky one. And I don't think I have all of the answers. And I think part of it is we are finding out as we are going along. But I'm also really struck by some of the comments that the panelists have also said about people becoming more aware, people becoming more interested in their histories, their cultures, and questioning the dominant narratives. And I think maybe repatriation is a process that helps us to understand a bit more about ourselves. So, well, of course, at the end, we have the end process, right, of the ancestors and the human dignity. And how we do that is still uncertain, of course. So, I mean, is it going to clans? Is it going to families? Is it going to the community? I mean, is there going to be a national memorial of some sort, which some people have been suggesting? So we don't really know the answers to all of that. But I think what I envision is a sense of a Naga family. And I think this image of a family was really, really important, especially in our meeting yesterday when someone said that, this is about our family. Ancestors are our family. So it's about the Naga family coming together and laying to rest the Naga ancestors. So I think that is what I envision, people coming together, sharing, and I hope it leads to healing. I think there's a lot of trauma, I think, in our culture. I think this notion of the body leaving a mark, is often a psychological kind of idea that, a lot of the traumas that people experience are actually from, previous experiences, and it's there in the body, right? We feel the pain, physically. And I do wonder if some of the kinds of collective pain that we feel is part of that, this unaddressed trauma that needs to be addressed, and we have to go through a process of healing. And to me, I think that is what Naga repatriation is. Now, your second question, I completely forgot. Please.
How do we take ownership of our history in this way?
Right. Thank you. I think how do we take ownership of our history is asking those simple questions. I think, we have been talking about Indigenous curriculum, and I think the kinds of education, kinds of knowledge that we hope, we are instilling upon the younger generation is simply about, being proud of our identity, being proud of the values which have been transmitted through the generations onto us, and not simply lie down and take everything, okay? And sometimes I think it's also asking those difficult questions. So how do we take ownership? It comes down to, of course, individuals, but there's also a community sense of where we are as a people. And I was struck by a comment that someone made to Laura and us, as we're in the Hornbill. And I think, I won't tell the identity of the person, but the person saw Laura and thought, it was because of your people that we are here now, that we are kind of advanced in all of that. And I think that trope is quite common, I think. We often see a white person and we go, oh, right, it's because of you that we have civilization and all of that, right? And I think that person is speaking from a certain generational experience, right? And I think all of us have that, in our communities, in our families. And I kept thinking, oh, right, perhaps even some of my older uncles and aunties might even think that. But then I thought about, what about the alternative ways in which we can think about this question or this encounter? That it was because of you guys that we have this. And that is where I think we need to challenge ourselves. Sometimes colonialism is so pervasive that it makes us complacent, and we think that there is only one form of knowledge. But I think we have to kind of disrupt that narrative by trying to ask other questions. And that is where I think we need to take ownership of our own history.